The military vehicles bounced and lurched along the unpaved road, their heavy frames groaning with each pothole, wheels churning through thick mud that sprayed in dark arcs behind them. Rain had fallen the night before, leaving the earth soft and treacherous. Inside the covered backs of these transports sat women in faded uniforms, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their bodies rigid with a mixture of fear and stubborn pride. These were auxiliaries of the defeated German forces, nurses who had tended wounded soldiers, clerks who had shuffled papers in military offices, radio operators who had transmitted messages across battlefields. Their clothing bore the stains of recent weeks, wrinkled and worn thin from constant use. Boots that had once been polished to a military shine were now scuffed and caked with dried mud. Yet despite the visible signs of their reduced circumstances, each woman held herself with deliberate posture, backs straight as iron rods, chins lifted in defiance against whatever awaited them at their destination. The convoy slowed as it approached a collection of wooden structures surrounded by wire fencing. Guard towers stood at intervals around the perimeter, though they seemed less imposing than the women had imagined. The gates, constructed of rough-cut lumber and strung with barbed wire, swung inward with a metallic screech. The trucks rolled to a stop in a courtyard of packed dirt, engines coughing and sputtering before falling silent. In the sudden quiet, the women could hear birds singing in distant trees, an absurdly peaceful sound given the circumstances. They had prepared themselves mentally for brutality, for shouted commands delivered with violence, perhaps for physical abuse. Stories had circulated among them during their transport about what happened to prisoners in enemy hands. They had steeled themselves against humiliation, against cruel treatment, against the harsh discipline they assumed would be inflicted upon them by their captors. What greeted them instead was utterly unexpected. As the canvas flaps at the rear of the trucks were pulled aside and light flooded in, the women blinked and squinted, adjusting to the brightness. Standing in loose formation around the courtyard were American soldiers, dozens of them, holding rifles but with an ease that seemed almost careless. Their weapons rested casually against shoulders or were grounded with the butts against the earth. Helmets sat at jaunty angles or were pushed back on heads, revealing tousled hair and young faces. One guard stood with his weight shifted to one leg, chewing something rhythmically, jaw working in a lazy motion. Suddenly his cheeks puffed, and a translucent pink bubble emerged from his lips, expanding until it burst with a sharp popping sound that echoed across the yard. Another soldier leaned heavily against his rifle, as though it were nothing more than a walking stick, using it to support his weight while he chatted with a companion. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms tanned and muscled from physical labour. He looked more like a farmhand taking a break from ploughing fields than a soldier guarding enemy prisoners. The German women exchanged glances, eyebrows raised in disbelief. They had been trained extensively in military protocol, had served under officers who demanded absolute precision and formality in every action. To them, a soldier was a machine, disciplined and rigid, every movement controlled and purposeful. What they saw before them violated every expectation. These Americans seemed barely military at all. They stood in casual clusters, talking among themselves, laughing at private jokes. Their uniforms, while recognizably military issue, were worn with a sloppiness that would have earned immediate punishment in the forces these women had known. One guard had his shirt partially untucked, another had rolled his pants cuffs unevenly. The overall impression was one of men who had been pulled from civilian life and dressed in soldiers' clothing, but who had never quite absorbed the military bearing that was supposed to accompany the uniform. A sound began among the prisoners, starting as a quiet snicker from somewhere in the middle of the group. It spread quickly, rippling through their ranks like wind through wheat. One woman, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, whispered in rapid German to her neighbour, gesturing subtly toward the gum-chewing guard. Her voice carried a note of incredulous amusement. "These are the men who defeated us." Another prisoner, younger with bright eyes that still held a spark of mischief despite weeks of hardship, pointed discreetly toward the soldier with the rolled sleeves. "Look at that one," she murmured. "He belongs behind a plough, not holding a rifle." Her companion stifled a laugh behind her hand, shoulders shaking with suppressed mirth. The absurdity of the situation struck them forcefully. They had been captured by men who seemed almost comically unprofessional, who lacked the cold efficiency they associated with military power. The American guards noticed the laughter. How could they not? It floated across the courtyard, unmistakable even though the words themselves were unintelligible. A few soldiers glanced at each other, expressions uncertain. But there was no anger in their reactions, no sharp commands to silence the mocking prisoners. Instead, one guard actually grinned, a sheepish expression crossing his face as though he understood perfectly well what was amusing the women and found it somewhat funny himself. He shrugged at a fellow soldier who shook his head with a wry smile. Another American, overhearing the laughter, scratched the back of his neck in an embarrassed gesture but made no move to retaliate or assert authority. This response, or rather this lack of aggressive response, was perhaps more unnerving than any punishment would have been. The women had been conditioned to expect certain patterns. Defiance would be met with force, mockery would provoke anger. This was the natural order of military discipline as they understood it. But these guards seemed utterly unfazed by the disrespect, almost as if they expected it or simply didn't care enough to react. The laughter grew bolder among the prisoners. When a young American soldier stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, catching himself before actually falling, several women giggled openly. His clumsiness seemed to confirm their assessment that these were amateurs, inexperienced boys playing at being warriors. Another cluster of prisoners whispered about the accents they could hear when the guards spoke English to each other, the loud casual tones so different from the clipped formal German military speech they were accustomed to. Everything about these Americans seemed wrong, seemed unmilitary, seemed almost civilian despite the uniforms they wore. Yet beneath the surface of their laughter, something else was stirring. Confusion crept in at the edges of their amusement. Why were these guards so patient? Why did they not strike back, assert dominance, enforce the hierarchy that should exist between captor and captive? The women had been prepared for cruelty. Cruelty they could understand, could categorize, could respond to with their own internal strength. But this tolerance, this almost good-natured acceptance of their mockery, was harder to pass. It didn't fit into their framework of how the world worked. A few women began to feel the first whispers of unease mixing with their ridicule. If these men didn't behave according to expected patterns, what did that mean? What else might be different from what they had been taught? One prisoner in particular found herself unsettled in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She was young, barely past 20, with dark brown hair that had escaped its pins and fell in loose strands around her face. As a nurse, she had seen terrible things during the war, had developed a protective shell of emotional distance to survive. Now, as she stood in the courtyard with the other women, her eyes were drawn to one of the guards. He was tall, taller than most of his companions, with a lanky build that suggested he hadn't quite finished growing into his frame. What caught her attention most were the freckles scattered across his nose and cheeks, giving him an almost boyish appearance despite the rifle in his hands. When he turned his head, scanning the group of prisoners, his gaze passed over her briefly. Their eyes met for just an instant. Instead of the contempt or lustful appraisal she had braced herself for, she saw something unexpected in those blue eyes. Curiosity, perhaps. A flicker of what might have been sympathy or simply human interest. It wasn't the look of a conqueror viewing his spoils. It was something more complicated, more personal. The brunette nurse turned her head sharply away, breaking the eye contact, her heart suddenly beating faster. She felt heat rising in her cheeks and told herself it was anger, indignation at being observed. But deep in her stomach, something had tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger. She pushed the feeling down, refusing to examine it. Around her, the other women were still laughing, still trading whispered comments about the guards' unprofessional appearance and behaviour. She forced herself to join in, to add her voice to theirs, but the laughter felt hollow in her throat. That brief glance had done something to her, had cracked some small part of the armour she had built around herself. She hated that it affected her. She hated that she was already replaying that moment in her mind, seeing again those freckles, those blue eyes, that expression that suggested he saw her as an individual rather than just another enemy prisoner. As the afternoon wore on, the women were processed through the intake procedures. They stood in lines while their names were checked against lists. They were assigned barracks numbers and given basic information about camp routines. The whole process was conducted with a casualness that continued to baffle them. In the military bureaucracy they had known, every administrative task was accompanied by rigidity and formality. Here, guards chatted with each other while checking names, made jokes, even smiled occasionally at the prisoners in what seemed like attempts at reassurance rather than intimidation. One woman muttered that it was all a trick, that the Americans were trying to make them lower their guard before revealing their true nature. But hours passed, and the cruelty never materialized. Evening was approaching when the women were finally marched to their assigned barracks. The wooden buildings were simple but solid, constructed quickly but competently. Inside, the air smelled of fresh sawdust and the faint tang of disinfectant soap. Rows of bunk beds lined the walls, each with a thin mattress and a folded blanket. Small windows near the ceiling let in the last golden light of day. It was spare and basic, but it was clean, far cleaner than the women had expected. Through the windows, they could see the guards outside, gathering in small groups as their shift ended. Cigarettes were passed around and lit. Laughter drifted through the air, casual and relaxed. The Americans seemed to be telling stories, jokes perhaps, their voices rising and falling in the rhythms of easy conversation. To the women watching from inside the barracks, it was a strange sight. These were men at their leisure, behaving as though this were any ordinary job rather than the serious business of guarding enemy prisoners. The German women settled onto their bunks, some sitting heavily with exhaustion, others remaining standing as they unpacked their few possessions. Conversation started quietly at first, then grew in volume as they processed the day's experiences. Some continued to mock the guards, calling them overgrown children playing soldier. One woman declared confidently that these Americans would never have survived a week under proper military discipline. Another scoffed at their obvious lack of training, their casual manners, their complete absence of the martial bearing that should define a soldier. The criticisms came easily, allowing the women to maintain their sense of superiority even in defeat. If their captors were incompetent amateurs, then perhaps their own surrender was less shameful. Perhaps it was only numerical superiority and industrial capacity that had won the war, not any true military prowess on the enemy's part. But as night settled over the camp and the talk gradually died down, a different mood crept in. The laughter from outside had faded. The guards had either gone off duty or settled into the quiet watchfulness of the night shift. In the dim interior of the barracks, illuminated only by a single weak bulb hanging from the ceiling, the women lay in their bunks and stared at the wooden slats above them or at the shadowed ceiling. The events of the day replayed in their minds, the absence of violence, the patience in the face of mockery. The small kindnesses, like the guard who had held open a door without being asked, or the one who had carried a heavy box that a prisoner was struggling with. These tiny gestures meant nothing on their own, perhaps, but accumulated over the course of hours, they created a picture that didn't match the propaganda these women had absorbed over years. The brunette nurse lay on her side, the thin blanket pulled up to her shoulder. She could hear the quiet breathing of other women around her, some already asleep, others lying awake as she was. Through the window, faint and distant, came the sound of voices. The guards on night duty were talking quietly among themselves. One laughed, a sound that carried clearly in the still air. It wasn't cruel laughter, wasn't mocking or harsh. It was simply the sound of young men passing time, finding amusement in something. She listened to it and felt that tightness in her chest again. In her mind, she saw the freckled guard's face, the way his eyes had looked at her. She whispered to herself in the darkness, barely audible even to her own ears. Fools. They are all fools. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. These men weren't fools. They were something else, something she didn't have words for yet, something that frightened her more than cruelty ever could. The women had arrived at the camp expecting to meet monsters, creatures of propaganda brought to life. They had steeled themselves for dehumanization, for treatment that would confirm everything they had been told about the enemy. Instead, they had been greeted by men who smiled, who were clumsy and casual, who showed small kindnesses without apparent thought. The prisoners had laughed to cover their confusion, to maintain some sense of control over a situation that was rapidly becoming incomprehensible. But now, in the quiet darkness, the laughter seemed like a thin shield against a truth none of them wanted to face. If the enemy wasn't monstrous, what did that say about the war they had just lost? What did it say about everything they had believed? The nurse felt her heart beating faster as these thoughts circled through her mind. She remembered those blue eyes again, the freckles scattered like copper pennies across sun-touched skin. She pushed the image away angrily, turned her face to the wall, tried to force her mind blank, but sleep was slow in coming. And when it finally arrived, she dreamed of things she couldn't quite remember upon waking, but which left her feeling unsettled and strangely warm. What had begun with mockery and ridicule was already changing, transforming into something more complex and far more dangerous. The first cracks had appeared in the wall these women had built around themselves. Curiosity was seeping through those cracks like water finding every weakness in stone. And once curiosity took root, it would grow into something they couldn't control. Dreams they couldn't admit. Desires they would never speak aloud. The seed had been planted on that first strange day, when laughter had masked confusion and defiance had hidden the first stirrings of something that felt perilously close to hope. Morning arrived with shocking abruptness. A bell clanged loudly across the camp, its metallic voice cutting through the last wisps of sleep and dragging the women from their bunks. They rose quickly, habits of military life asserting themselves despite the unfamiliar surroundings. Within minutes, they had dressed and assembled outside the barracks, forming rough lines for the morning roll call. The air was cool and fresh, carrying the scent of dew-wet grass and distant pine trees. Mist still clung to the ground in patches, lending an ethereal quality to the early light. The women stood with their backs straight, maintaining the posture drilled into them through months and years of service. Some still wore expressions of defiance, chins raised and eyes hard. They were determined not to show weakness, not to let their captors see any crack in their resolve. The American guards moved along the rows with clipboards, checking names against their lists. Their movements were unhurried, almost leisurely. One soldier yawned widely as he approached his assigned section of prisoners, not bothering to cover his mouth. His helmet was perched precariously on the back of his head, threatening to slide off entirely with each step he took. Several women noticed this, and quiet whispers rippled through their ranks. One prisoner nudged her neighbour with an elbow, tilting her head slightly to indicate the yawning guard. Her companion bit back a smile, her eyes dancing with suppressed laughter. Another woman focused her attention on a different soldier whose boots, upon closer inspection, appeared to be mismatched. They were similar but not identical, as though he had grabbed whatever was available in the dim light of early morning. The observation was passed along in hushed German, and more faces lit with barely concealed amusement. The laughter that bubbled up among them was quieter than yesterday's open mockery, but it was still there, threading through the formation like an undercurrent. It felt safer to laugh, to find these small absurdities and use them as ammunition against the uncertainty they all felt. By making the guards objects of ridicule, the women could maintain some sense of power, some control over their situation. They whispered about the casual way the Americans performed even basic military functions, the lack of precision in their movements, the absence of the sharp, almost mechanical efficiency that had characterized the forces they had served. To women trained under strict hierarchy and unforgiving standards, this American casualness seemed not just unprofessional, but almost incomprehensible. Yet even as they laughed, something had shifted from the previous day. The mockery felt thinner now, less certain. It carried an edge of unease that hadn't been there before. Several women had spent the night thinking about the kindnesses they'd observed, the patience the guards had shown. These memories complicated the simple narrative of ridicule they were trying to maintain. When the soldiers failed to react to the whispered jokes, failed to snap at them or demand silence, that failure to respond felt heavier this morning than it had yesterday. The women wanted provocation. They wanted anger. Because anger would confirm that these men were what they needed them to be, the enemy, cruel and harsh and easy to hate. But the Americans simply continued their work, calm and indifferent, occasionally even smiling as though they found the whole situation vaguely amusing rather than threatening. One guard, passing close to a cluster of prisoners, clearly overheard their whispered German conversation. He glanced over, and for a moment his eyes met those of the woman who had been speaking. She fell silent immediately, bracing for a reprimand. Instead, the corner of his mouth quirked upward in what might have been a sympathetic smirk, as though he understood perfectly well that he and his fellow soldiers were being made fun of, and found it rather funny himself. The woman felt heat rush to her cheeks. She looked away quickly, confused by the reaction. Mockery should provoke anger or at minimum cold indifference. This good-natured acknowledgement of absurdity was outside her experience. It suggested a self-awareness, a willingness to laugh at oneself, that felt distinctly unmilitary and strangely human. For the German women, this lack of anger was profoundly unsettling in ways that went beyond the immediate situation. They had been raised in a culture that prized absolute authority and demanded unquestioning obedience. The men who had commanded them, whether military officers or civilian officials, would never have tolerated such disrespect. Punishment would have been swift and harsh for behavior like this. But these Americans seemed to operate under different rules entirely. Their authority appeared to rest not on fear or rigid discipline, but on some other foundation the women couldn't quite identify. It made them question things they hadn't thought to question before. If the enemy was not cruel, if they did not exercise power through intimidation and violence, then what did that mean? What did it say about the systems the women had served, the leaders they had followed? These thoughts stirred uncomfortably in several minds as the roll call concluded and the women were released for breakfast. They walked in groups toward the camp kitchens, a long, low building from which smoke rose and interesting smells drifted. As they approached, the scent grew stronger and more distinct. Bacon frying, unmistakable and rich. Coffee brewing, robust and dark. Fresh bread baking. One woman wrinkled her nose dramatically and made a show of disgust. "This is what they eat," she announced loudly enough for others to hear. She pretended to gag, her hand covering her mouth theatrically. Her companions joined in the performance, making faces and commenting on how heavy and unrefined the American food smelled compared to the more delicate cuisine they were accustomed to. But when they filed through the serving line and received their trays, the performance became harder to maintain. The plates were piled with scrambled eggs, fluffy and yellow, strips of crispy bacon, thick slices of bread that were still warm, butter melting into the porous surface, fried potatoes seasoned with salt and pepper. It was more food than most of them had seen on a single plate in months. The war had brought severe rationing, had made meals progressively smaller and less varied as resources dwindled. Many of these women had been living on thin soup and stale bread for weeks. Now they stood holding trays laden with abundance. The laughter faltered. Hunger, it turned out, was a more powerful force than pride. The women found seats at long wooden tables and began to eat. They tried to maintain their show of disdain, taking small bites and making faces. But their actions betrayed them. They ate quickly, almost desperately, hands moving from plate to mouth with increasing speed. The warmth of the food spread through their bodies, fighting back the constant chill of insufficient calories. Flavors exploded on tongues that had almost forgotten what well-seasoned food tasted like. The eggs were rich and satisfying. The bacon was salty and crunchy. The bread was soft and filling. Despite themselves, despite their determination to hate everything about this place and their captors, they couldn't deny the simple physical pleasure of a good hot meal. One of the guards assigned to kitchen duty noticed the change in the women's behavior. He stood near the serving line, watching as they devoured their breakfast despite their earlier protests. A faint smile crossed his face, not mocking but understanding, as though he saw right through the act and recognized it for what it was, a desperate attempt to maintain dignity in the face of basic human need. He said nothing, made no comment that might embarrass them further. But his silence somehow felt heavier than words would have been. It was the weight of being seen, truly seen, in a moment of vulnerability. Several women noticed him watching and felt their cheeks burn with shame they couldn't admit. They had been caught in their pretense, exposed in their hunger, revealed as human rather than the disciplined military machines they tried to present. The meal continued in relative quiet, the earlier mockery completely abandoned now. Conversation was muted, focused on practical matters. Pass the salt. Is there more coffee? Small requests and brief acknowledgements. The women kept their eyes mostly on their plates, avoiding looking at the guards or at each other too directly. When the meal ended and they filed back out into the yard, some still feeling the uncomfortable fullness of stomachs too long empty and now overfilled, the mood had shifted yet again. The laughter that had been their shield against fear was wearing thin. Too many small moments had chipped away at it. The patient guard who had smiled at being mocked. The good food provided without comment. The absence of cruelty where cruelty had been expected. That night, when the women gathered again in their barracks after a long day of various work assignments and camp routines, the conversation took a different turn. Some still tried to mock the guards, repeating familiar complaints about their lack of military bearing, their casual manners, their obvious unsuitability for the roles they had been assigned. But these comments rang hollow now, met with less enthusiasm than before. Others in the group had fallen quiet, sitting on their bunks with distant expressions, lost in private thoughts. One woman finally voiced what several had been thinking. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as though she was afraid of the question even as she asked it. Why do they not hate us? The words hung in the air. No one had an answer. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. They all felt it, this absence of the hatred they had expected, had been prepared for, had perhaps even deserved given the war their nation had waged. These Americans had every reason to despise them, to treat them with contempt and cruelty. Yet instead there was patience, there were small kindnesses, there was food and shelter, and a basic respect that defied all logic. The women couldn't reconcile this reality with what they had been taught about their enemies. The cognitive dissonance created a deep unease that settled over the barracks like a cold fog. The brunette nurse lay in her bunk, hands folded on her stomach, eyes fixed on the rough wooden boards above her. Her mind was full of the freckled guard again. She had seen him several times throughout the day, always at a distance, always busy with his duties. Once, when food was being distributed for the midday meal, he had been the one handing out the trays. When she stepped forward to receive hers, their eyes had met again. His hands, she noticed, were steady as he passed her the tray. Not trembling with malice or aggression, but calm and sure. There was a quiet competence in the gesture that spoke of someone comfortable in his role, comfortable with himself. His eyes, those blue eyes beneath the copper freckles, had held hers for just a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary. She had looked away first, her pulse quickening in a way that made her angry at herself. Now, lying in the darkness with the sounds of other women breathing and shifting around her, she replayed that moment obsessively. Why did it matter? Why should the briefest of glances from an enemy soldier affect her this way? She whispered to herself, so quietly that no one else could possibly hear, the words almost just shaped by her lips without sound. Foolish. Dangerous. Do not think this way. But the image stayed, persistent and glowing in her mind like an ember that refused to cool. The steadiness of his hands, the colour of his eyes, the scatter of freckles, the sense that when he looked at her, he saw her not as a faceless prisoner, not as a number on a list, but as an individual, as a person. Perhaps even, God help her, as a woman. The thought made her heart race with something that wasn't quite fear, but felt equally dangerous. She rolled onto her side, pulling the blanket up over her shoulder, tucking it under her chin. Through the small window, she could see stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. From somewhere outside came the low murmur of voices, guards talking among themselves during the night shift. The sound was oddly comforting, suggesting a world that continued on, normal and mundane, despite the barbed wire and the circumstances. She closed her eyes and tried to force sleep to come. But her mind continued to turn, examining and re-examining each small interaction of the day, looking for meaning, looking for answers to questions she wasn't ready to fully formulate. The laughter of the first day already seemed like something from long ago, though only 2 days had passed. What had started as sharp ridicule was transforming into something more complicated. The women were still prisoners. The Americans were still their captors. Those facts hadn't changed. But the emotional landscape was shifting beneath their feet like sand, and none of them quite knew how to navigate it. Mockery had given way to unease. Unease was beginning to give way to something else entirely, something that whispered in the darkness, something that made hearts beat faster and cheeks flush with warmth, something dangerous and forbidden and utterly human. Curiosity. That was the word none of them wanted to say aloud. Curiosity about these men who smiled instead of sneering, who helped instead of harming, who seemed so fundamentally different from anything they had expected. And with curiosity came the first tendrils of attraction, winding through thoughts like vines through a fence, impossible to uproot once they had taken hold. The women told themselves it meant nothing, that it was just the strangeness of the situation, that it would pass. But deep down, some part of each of them knew that a door had been opened that could never quite be closed again, and on the other side of that door lay territory unmapped and dangerous, where the rules they had always known no longer seemed to apply. Days began to blur into each other, each one following a similar pattern. Morning bell, roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, evening in the barracks, sleep. The rhythm of camp life established itself with surprising speed. The German women found their bodies adjusting to the routine, their minds settling into the predictable flow of scheduled activities. Yet within this superficial sameness, subtle changes continued to accumulate. The laughter that had been so prominent in those first days had almost completely faded now. In its place was a different kind of attention, more focused and more dangerous. The women watched, they observed, they noticed things. During roll call, they no longer giggled at the guards' casual postures. Instead, they studied faces, learned to recognize individuals. That one had a slight limp, probably from an old injury. This one habitually ran his hand through his hair when he was thinking. Another had a habit of whistling tunelessly under his breath while working. These small individual characteristics, once invisible behind the uniform of American soldier, now became distinct and interesting. The prisoners found themselves able to identify guards from a distance by their walk, by the way they stood, by small gestures and mannerisms unique to each man. At the kitchens, where the women gathered 3 times daily for meals, the observations continued. One guard in particular seemed perpetually clumsy, always nearly dropping something or stumbling over his own feet. One afternoon, he was carrying a wooden crate filled with loaves of bread when one corner slipped from his grip. He caught it just before it fell, but the motion was ungainly and desperate. Instead of cursing or showing frustration, he laughed at himself, a full, open sound of genuine amusement. His fellow guards nearby joined in the laughter, one calling out what was clearly a teasing comment that made the clumsy soldier grin wider and shake his head ruefully. It was such a human moment, so free of pretension or false dignity. A young German clerk who had been watching felt her automatic smirk of mockery fade before it fully formed. She had been prepared to whisper to her neighbour about American incompetence. But watching the easy camaraderie among the guards, the way they laughed at themselves without shame, stopped her. She found herself whispering instead, "They laugh at themselves." Her companion looked puzzled. The clerk tried to explain, struggled to articulate what she was observing. "In our world," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "such clumsiness would bring shame. It would be punished or at minimum criticized severely. But these men, they make it into a joke. They find it funny rather than shameful." The observation felt significant somehow, though she wasn't quite sure why. It spoke to a fundamental difference in cultures, in ways of being human. The rigid hierarchy and demand for perfection that had governed her life felt suddenly oppressive when compared to this easy acceptance of imperfection. It was unsettling to realize that strength might take forms other than the ones she had been taught to recognize. During work assignments, more of these small revelations occurred. The women were often given tasks like helping with laundry, sorting supplies, maintaining the campgrounds. The work wasn't particularly difficult, but it was physically demanding, especially for those weakened by weeks of poor nutrition and stress. One afternoon, a prisoner was struggling to carry a large bucket filled with water. It was heavy, sloshing with each step, and her arms trembled with the effort. She gritted her teeth, determined not to show weakness, not to ask for help from the enemy. She expected perhaps for a guard to shout at her to move faster, or to mock her struggling. Instead, an American soldier appeared at her side. Without a word, he reached out and took hold of the other handle of the bucket. Together, they carried it to the barracks where it was needed. The woman was too stunned to speak. She walked mechanically, her hands gripping her side of the handle, her mind racing. The guard said nothing during the short walk. When they reached the destination and set the bucket down, he simply nodded at her, a brief acknowledgement, and walked away to return to his post. The woman stood staring after him, her heart pounding. In all her years of service, in all her interactions with German officers and officials, she could not remember a single instance when a man of rank had helped her with a physical task without expectation of something in return. Men gave orders. Women obeyed. That was the natural hierarchy. But this American had violated that rule completely. He had helped simply because help was needed, without fanfare, without demanding gratitude, without leveraging the moment for any kind of advantage. That night, the incident was discussed in whispers among the women. Some immediately dismissed it as a calculated move, part of some larger strategy to win their trust and make them compliant. But the woman who had experienced it shook her head. There was no strategy in it, she insisted quietly. It was too simple, too unremarkable to him. He didn't even wait for thanks. One of her listeners, an older woman who had worked in military administration, spoke slowly. "I cannot remember," she said, her voice barely audible, "the last time a man helped me without wanting something in return." The statement hung in the air, heavy with implications none of them wanted to fully explore. The brunette nurse lay in her bunk that night, listening to these whispered conversations, but not participating. Her own observations were becoming increasingly personal and increasingly troubling. The freckled guard seemed to be everywhere she looked. Or perhaps she was simply noticing him more than the others. She had learned his patterns, knew where he would likely be stationed at different times of day. She told herself it was simple pattern recognition, the kind of awareness that came from being observant in a confined space. But she knew she was lying to herself. She looked for him. She wanted to see him. And when their paths crossed, when their eyes met for those brief, inevitable moments, she felt her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He noticed her too. She was certain of it now. His glances lingered just slightly too long. Once, passing her in the yard, he nodded in acknowledgement. It was the smallest possible gesture, barely noticeable. Just a slight downward tilt of his head, his eyes meeting hers for a heartbeat. But that simple nod sent a shock through her system like electricity. It was recognition. It was acknowledgement of her as an individual. Not a leer, not a command, not a threat. Just a quiet greeting between two people who saw each other. The innocence of the gesture somehow made it more powerful, more dangerous. She could have defended herself against hostility or unwanted attention. But how did one defend against simple courtesy, against kindness? She found herself thinking about him at odd moments throughout the day, wondering about his life before the war, trying to imagine him in civilian clothes, working at some ordinary job. What had he done before being drafted? Was he a farmer, given those muscled forearms, a factory worker, a student? Did he have family waiting for him somewhere? A sweetheart writing letters he read in quiet moments? The questions multiplied in her mind, each one leading to more. She caught herself creating stories, imagining conversations they might have if circumstances were different, if there were no barbed wire between them, no war that had made them enemies. The realization of what she was doing horrified her. She would catch herself mid-daydream and mentally shake herself, angry and ashamed. She would whisper fierce self-criticisms into her pillow at night. Foolish girl, dangerous foolishness. He is the enemy. You are a prisoner. This cannot be. But the thoughts wouldn't stop. The more she tried to suppress them, the more insistently they returned. Images of his face, the sound of his voice on the few occasions she'd heard him speak English, the way his hands moved when he was working. All of it had burned itself into her memory with painful clarity. Other women were experiencing similar struggles, though most kept their thoughts private. Small gestures from the guards were becoming treasures, moments to be collected and examined in the privacy of one's own mind. A guard who left an extra piece of bread on a tray, another who adjusted a blanket that had fallen off a prisoner who had dozed off sitting against a building. These tiny acts of consideration were noticed, catalogued, replayed endlessly. The women didn't speak of these things aloud during the day. It was too dangerous, too revealing. But at night, in the darkness of the barracks, whispers began. One woman confessed in a barely audible voice that she had dreamed of an American soldier offering her flowers. The dream had been so vivid, so real. In it, they had been in a garden somewhere, sunlight warm on her face, and he had handed her a bouquet with a shy smile. She had woken with tears on her face, filled with a longing so acute it physically hurt. Another admitted that she found herself staring at the way one particular guard's hands moved when he played cards with his fellows during their breaks. The dexterity of his fingers, the easy confidence of his movements, had captured her attention in a way she couldn't explain and didn't want to examine too closely. At first, these confessions were met with nervous laughter, the kind that seeks to diffuse tension by treating serious things as jokes. But the laughter was thin and unconvincing. Everyone in that barracks knew these weren't jokes. They were admissions of something dangerous, something that violated every rule they had been raised to follow. German women were supposed to be paragons of loyalty, disciplined and controlled, dedicated to their nation and their people. To feel attraction to enemy soldiers was more than just inappropriate. It was a form of betrayal, both of their defeated nation and of their own identities as proper German women. Yet the feelings persisted, growing stronger despite every effort to crush them. During the day, the women maintained their careful distance, their proper reserve. They performed their assigned tasks efficiently, kept their expressions neutral, avoided unnecessary interaction with the guards. But their eyes betrayed them. Glances that lasted just a moment too long. Attention that followed certain soldiers as they moved around the camp. Small, involuntary reactions when a particular guard smiled or spoke. One evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of orange and pink, The women watched through their barracks window as a group of guards gathered outside their own quarters. Someone had produced a deck of cards, and the men settled into a game, sitting on overturned crates and borrowed chairs. Their voices carried across the distance, punctuated by laughter and good-natured trash talk. The German women stood at the window, silent spectators of this scene of male camaraderie. They watched the easy way the men interacted with each other, the teasing and joking, the casual physical contact of a hand on a shoulder or a playful shove. There was an openness to their interactions, a lack of rigid formality that was simultaneously foreign and deeply appealing. The brunette nurse pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the wall, eyes closed, listening to the distant sounds of laughter. Her lips moved in a barely audible whisper. They are not supposed to be like this. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Everything she had been taught said that enemies should be monstrous, cruel, easy to hate. But these men were none of those things. They were frustratingly, dangerously human. They laughed and joked and played cards just like soldiers anywhere might do. They were young men thrust into the role of guards, doing their jobs with a casualness that suggested this wasn't who they really were, just a temporary duty to be fulfilled. And buried deep in her heart, where she barely dared acknowledge it even to herself, a thought formed. Treasonous and terrible and impossible to suppress entirely. What if they are better than the men we followed into war? What if the boys who once marched in perfect formation under the banner of that awful man with the moustache, the one whose name she couldn't even think anymore without revulsion, what if those rigidly disciplined soldiers had been worse men than these casual Americans? What if the very things she had once thought made her side superior, the discipline and hierarchy and iron control, what if those had actually been symptoms of something rotten at the core? The thought was too dangerous to fully form, too challenging to everything she had built her identity around. She pushed it away, locked it in a far corner of her mind. But it had been thought, and once thought, it couldn't be completely unthought. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it would grow in the darkness of her subconscious, whether she wanted it to or not. The barracks fell quiet eventually. Women climbed into their bunks, pulled thin blankets over themselves, settled into restless sleep. But many lay awake long into the night, staring at shadowed ceilings, wrestling with thoughts and feelings they couldn't control. The laughter that had once been their shield was completely gone now. In its place was a heavy silence, broken only by quiet breathing and the occasional sigh. The women were caught between what they had been taught to believe and what they were experiencing, between loyalty to a defeated cause and the undeniable humanity of their captors. It was an impossible position, one that created constant internal conflict. And somewhere in that conflict, in the space between duty and desire, something fragile was beginning to grow. Call it hope, call it longing, call it the simple human need for connection. Whatever its name, it was dangerous. It threatened to break down the walls these women had built to protect themselves. It whispered that perhaps the barbed wire separating prisoner from guard was not as insurmountable as it seemed, that perhaps in some impossible future those barriers might fall away entirely. The thought was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure, and none of them knew what to do with it except to lie awake in the darkness, hearts racing, imagining possibilities they would never dare speak aloud. By the time the second month rolled around, a strange new normalcy had settled over the camp. The daily routines continued unchanged, the structure of prison life proceeding with mechanical regularity. But beneath that surface order, currents of tension swirled and eddied. The women no longer laughed at the Americans. That phase had passed completely, seeming now like something from a distant past despite being only weeks ago. Instead, their relationship to their captors had evolved into something more complex, more charged with unspoken meaning. They stole glances now, quick sidelong looks when they thought no one was watching. During the distribution of supplies one afternoon, a guard handed a young prisoner a freshly laundered blanket. It was a routine interaction, happened dozens of times each day. But when he passed her the folded fabric, their fingers touched. Just the briefest contact, fingertips brushing as the blanket changed hands. Both froze for an instant. His eyes met hers, and he smiled. Not a smirk, not a commanding expression, but a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes and created small crinkles at their corners. The woman felt her breath catch in her throat, felt heat rush through her body from that small point of contact. She took the blanket mechanically, murmured something unintelligible, and hurried away. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. That night, lying in her bunk, she replayed the moment obsessively. The texture of his fingertips against hers, rough and calloused from work, the warmth of his skin, the way his smile had transformed his whole face, made him look younger and more open. She told herself it was nothing, just accident, just a meaningless moment in a meaningless day. But she couldn't make herself believe it. That smile haunted her. In a world that had become grey and cold and defined by loss, that smile had been a burst of colour, of warmth, of possibility. She hated how much power such a small thing could have over her thoughts and feelings. The women began whispering among themselves after lights out with greater frequency and greater daring. One reported that she had found a small carved wooden figure on a windowsill, a bird perched on a branch, carved with surprising skill and obvious care. No one knew who had left it there or for whom it was intended, but its presence felt significant. Like a secret message in a language none of them quite spoke. Another woman mentioned that she had heard one of the guards humming a German tune one morning, something her grandmother used to sing. The sound had stopped her in her tracks, filled her with such sudden homesickness and confusion that she had to turn away quickly to hide threatening tears. How did he know that song? Why would he hum it? What did it mean? Such things blurred the lines that were supposed to be clear and absolute. Captor and captive, enemy and enemy, American and German. These categories that should have defined every interaction were becoming muddied by small acts of humanity that crossed boundaries as though they didn't exist. The women found themselves unsettled in fundamental ways. If the enemy could show this kind of thoughtfulness, could possess this kind of sensitivity, then what did that mean about everything else? About the war, about the causes they had served, about the stories they had been told about who was good and who was evil. One afternoon during a work detail, something happened that several women witnessed and which became the subject of intense whispered discussion later. A prisoner, exhausted from poor sleep and the emotional strain of captivity, stumbled while carrying a load of folded linens. She caught herself before falling completely, but several sheets spilled onto the ground, landing in a patch of mud left over from recent rain. She stood staring down at the soiled fabric, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. She was so tired, so overwhelmed, and this small mishap felt like the final unbearable weight. An American guard was nearby and had seen the incident. He walked over, and the woman braced herself for rebuke or mockery. Instead, he bent down and helped her gather the fallen linens. He said something in English she didn't understand, his tone gentle and reassuring. Then he took the muddy sheets from her hands and gestured for her to continue with the clean ones, apparently indicating that he would deal with the soiled fabric himself. The woman was stunned into immobility. She stared at him, unable to comprehend what was happening. Never in her life had a man, particularly a man of authority, taken responsibility for her mistake rather than punishing her for it. The guard seemed slightly embarrassed by her intense stare. He smiled awkwardly, made a small shooing motion with his hand to indicate she should move along, and carried the dirty linens toward the laundry area himself. The woman walked away in a daze, her mind reeling. Other prisoners who had witnessed the exchange looked at each other with wide eyes. No one spoke, but everyone understood. Something significant had just happened, though none of them could quite articulate what it meant. The brunette nurse had not been present for that particular incident, but she heard about it in the whispered conversations that night. The story was told and retold, each woman adding her interpretation. Some insisted it was manipulation, a calculated move to make them trust their captors. But others, increasingly many others, couldn't maintain that explanation. There were too many small kindnesses accumulating, too many gestures that served no strategic purpose. The guards weren't trying to extract information or gain cooperation for some scheme. They were simply being decent in small ways when opportunities presented themselves. And that simple decency was more subversive than any grand gesture of cruelty would have been. It was impossible to hate men who helped gather your spilled laundry or carved birds for unknown recipients or hummed your grandmother's songs. The nurse's own interactions with the freckled guard continued to accumulate. She was acutely aware now that he looked for her just as she looked for him. During roll call, his eyes would find her in the line. During meal distribution, he would somehow often end up being the one to hand her a tray. These couldn't all be coincidences. They were too frequent, too consistent. He was engineering these small moments of proximity, just as she had started unconsciously positioning herself where she was more likely to encounter him. Neither acknowledged this dance explicitly. It remained entirely unspoken, communicated only through glances and small adjustments of position. But both knew. The knowledge hung between them, electric and dangerous. One evening, she found herself standing near the fence that marked the boundary of the prisoner area, ostensibly just getting some air before returning to the barracks. The freckled guard was on duty nearby. For several minutes, they existed in the same space, perhaps 20 feet apart, not looking at each other directly, but intensely aware of each other's presence. The air felt charged, as though the space between them was filled with all the words they couldn't speak. Finally, unable to bear it, the nurse turned to head back inside. As she did, she glanced back over her shoulder. He was looking at her. Their eyes met. He didn't smile this time. His expression was serious, almost questioning, as though he was asking her something without words. Her heart clenched painfully in her chest. She looked away and hurried back to the barracks, her legs trembling. That night, she couldn't sleep at all. She lay staring at nothing, her mind filled with that look, that unspoken question. What had he been asking? What did he want to know? And God help her, what did she want to answer? The dangerous thoughts she had been suppressing pushed forward with renewed force. She imagined conversations, imagined his voice saying her name, imagined scenarios where the war was over and they were just two people meeting under normal circumstances. The fantasies were so vivid they felt almost real, and when she finally dragged herself back to reality, the return was painful. This was madness. This was impossible. Yet she couldn't stop. Other women were engaged in similar internal struggles, though few spoke openly about the depth of their feelings. The whispers in the dark grew more daring. One woman admitted she wished she knew how to ask a guard his name. Names had power. Names made people real in ways that uniforms and roles did not. Another confessed she dreamed of dancing, of music playing, of a hand extended to her in invitation under moonlight. These were not prisoners' dreams. These were the dreams of young women imagining romance, imagining futures, imagining lives untouched by war and defeat. The dreams were dangerous precisely because they were so normal, so human, so disconnected from the reality of barbed wire and guards and the status of defeated enemy nationals. The nurse remained silent during these confessions, but her silence was eloquent. The other women noticed how her gaze would sometimes go distant, unfocused, as though she was seeing something they couldn't. They noticed how she lingered at the door during roll calls, how her attention would track certain movements in the yard. She didn't need to speak. Everyone understood. She was perhaps the furthest gone of any of them, most deeply caught in the dangerous current of these forbidden feelings. That evening, as darkness settled fully over the camp, the familiar sound of the harmonica drifted through the air. The red-haired soldier who played it had become something of a fixture, his evening music a marker of day's end. Tonight the tune was different from his usual repertoire. Slower, more contemplative, touched with a melancholy that seemed to match the mood settling over both guards and prisoners. The notes floated through the still air, weaving between the buildings, slipping through the windows of the women's barracks. The prisoners fell silent, listening. Some closed their eyes. Others stared at the ceiling, letting the music wash over them. The nurse listened with her whole being, feeling each note like a physical touch. Music had always affected her deeply, and this simple melody played on a cheap harmonica somehow carried more emotional weight than any symphony she'd heard in grand concert halls before the war. It spoke of longing, of distance, of things lost and perhaps never to be found again. It spoke directly to the ache in her chest, gave voice to feelings she couldn't articulate. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, sliding silently down her temples into her hair. She didn't wipe them away, just lay still, letting them come, letting the music strip away her defenses until she felt raw and exposed. When the music finally stopped, the silence that followed was profound. No one in the barracks spoke. No one moved. They lay in their bunks, each woman alone with thoughts she couldn't share, feelings she couldn't express, desires she couldn't fulfill. The space between what they wanted and what was possible had never felt wider or more unbridgeable. Yet paradoxically, that very impossibility seemed to make the wanting stronger. Because it could never be acted upon, because it had to remain forever in the realm of imagination and stolen glances, it grew more powerful in their hearts. Forbidden fruit, all the sweeter for being forbidden. The brunette nurse whispered into the darkness, her voice so quiet it couldn't possibly be heard by anyone else. She wasn't even sure she meant to speak aloud. It is dangerous to smile. But I did. The words hung in the air for a moment, a confession to no one, an admission that she had crossed some internal boundary from which there was no return. She had smiled back at the freckled guard, more than once. She had allowed warmth to show in her expression, had permitted her eyes to soften when they met his. Small betrayals of the emotional wall she was supposed to maintain, tiny cracks through which something new and frightening was pouring in. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not just what it meant to be captured, not just what it meant to be a prisoner, but what it meant to be seen. Really seen. Not as enemy, not as a number, not as a category, but as an individual, as herself. The freckled guard, whose name she still didn't know, saw her. She was certain of it. When his eyes met hers, there was recognition there of something specific and particular. He didn't just see a German prisoner. He saw her, and somehow that seeing, that acknowledgement of her individual existence, felt more intimate than touch, more powerful than words. The danger was no longer in guns or fences. Those were obvious, external, manageable threats. The real danger lay in smiles that lingered too long, in glances that communicated things better left unsaid, in hearts that refused to obey the rules of war and nationality and proper behaviour. The danger was in the slow dissolution of barriers that were supposed to be absolute, in the creeping realization that the enemy had a human face, and that face could be kind and gentle and worthy of something far more complicated than simple hatred. The women fell asleep eventually, one by one, exhausted by the emotional weight they carried. But their dreams betrayed them, filled with images of Americans offering flowers, extending hands, speaking words of affection in accented but sincere tones. And when they woke in the grey light of morning, they felt shame mixed with longing, unable to meet each other's eyes, knowing they had all travelled to the same forbidden territory in sleep.